Hello and welcome. This is Congruent with Cass the Coo and me, Seal the Human. Today's topic is transgender athletes. The major focus of the anti-trans athlete push is on trans women and how they shouldn't be able to compete with cis women because reasons. Let's start at the top. The Olympic Games have allowed transgender participants since 2003, yet it's 2021 and we'll finally be seeing the first trans athletes at the Olympics almost 20 years later. Sadly, the narrative being pushed is that women are just weaker and worse at competitions than men, and trans women are just men in disguise, so they're superior in every way to their cis competition. Yikes. That testosterone is the sole influence on one's athletic capabilities, and nothing can be done to a system that has higher testosterone. And once you have higher testosterone, you are doomed for the rest of your life to superiority. Yet, even when it comes to women, like Caster Semenya, assigned female at birth, identifying as female, participating with other women, her elevated testosterone, due to body functions outside her control, is also an issue. Really? So it's not really just trans women, but any woman who doesn't fit precise and very specific standards of what a woman actually is. Those like Caster, who are intersex or don't fit specific regimens of gender definitions, are targeted and attacked. And who is it that gets to make these arbitrary guidelines? The whole idea that trans women are taking over women's sports is honestly a pretty disgusting take that has no basis in fact, nor is there science to back up any claims made. Trans women have been repeatedly targeted and attacked with increasing frequency in the last 20 years. To note, 3 months into 2021, there have already been more than 80 anti-trans bills introduced to legislation in the United States of America. That's more than the entirety of 2020. And by June of 2021, over 250 anti-LGBT bills have been introduced, 17 of them becoming law. Much of this is focused on transphobic takes of trans girls, and to what end? Most of the people that agree with the legislation vary from protections of the status quo to outright let's annihilate them all because God said it's not natural. Transphobes try to play on the fears of the communities they are present in, and a lot of times are successful in garnering support and ideals that do nothing to support protecting societal norms, but instead seek to attack a very marginalized and disenfranchised group of people. There's a lot to be said about the treatment of LGBT individuals, and specifically trans individuals, but the rate of depression, mental illness, and suicide aren't just because their brains are bad, or they're cursed, or they get what they deserve. It's a sickening atmosphere where their very existence get questioned on a daily basis, from everyday interactions with cis people on the street to rights being used as pawns at the very highest level of government policymaking. Maybe being trans doesn't actually affect a person's outlook on life, or their mental stability, or their capabilities to live life to the fullest. Maybe being trans in this society, this particular one, the one in which we all live in, maybe that pressure and the hatred and stigmatizations that go along with it are what cause the distress. Some of the loudest voices of the transphobia crowd are so-called feminists, who are looking to turn their hatred towards a group of people they feel are inferior and not worthy of some arbitrary definition of womanhood. They will ignore the existence of trans men in their crusades when it comes to bathroom conflicts, sports teams, and shared personal spaces. And funny enough, some of the same hatred against trans women gets funneled with pictures of trans men saying they shouldn't be allowed in girls-only spaces. Well, yeah, of course they shouldn't. Trans men are men, trans women are women. It's simple, get over it. Yet, they try to find some way to distinguish differences like it matters. Look at this irrefutable fact on why they aren't actually women. It's their chromosomes. No, it's their gametes. No, it's blah, blah, blah. Books like Irreversible Damage by the transphobic TERF Abigail Shrier make up phenomena about trans men in a transphobic attack on people's abilities to transition. Another book from 2020, The End of Gender, by the also transphobic TERF Deborah So, ties everything back to gametes in adults, always looking for that next reason that trans women aren't real women, always on the lookout for ways to, in the end, point the finger and say, oh, hey, see? You're actually just a man deep down inside. Like, they're not debating somebody's existence and right to live. Of course, at the top of the pile is Joanne TERF Rawling, who, after a long and storied history of TERFing, went full mask off and published an essay in mid-2020 describing the harm of transgender activism in the world today. That essay also won a BBC award, just in case anyone is in doubt about institutional transphobia. It's fine, though. She's just being protective of women, though, real ones, with chromosomes and genes and the gametes and everything to prove that they aren't just another man who wanted to play dress up and harass people in bathrooms. Those women. See how disgusting this is? In fact, the pushback from so-called feminists against trans women's rights actively inhibits the movement of rights and protections of all women. Scare tactics like using the bathroom debate have simply led to more violence and more women feeling unsafe using public restrooms. Who defines what is feminine enough to be considered woman, then? Attacks and fear have increased of androgynous or even butch or masculine women, cis women, in those very spaces, simply because any indication that they aren't woman enough to be in this space suddenly means they are sexually predatory men just waiting to pounce on someone as they leave the stall from taking a huge to sexually assault and molest them. Trans activism isn't eroding society. It's not ruining the youth of today. What's actually making things more dangerous are those very feminists and the anti-woke people who are holding women's rights at gunpoint while putting blame on something entirely different. The bathroom debate is not going away anytime soon, as stupid of an argument as it is. None of these fear-mongering scare tactics will be going away anytime soon. The push that has been happening this year, and more recently in spotlights, is that of sports. We can't have our girls playing sports with fake girls. Whenever transphobic groups can, they will target children, as if gatekeeping and adding stress and their own hatred into teenagers' already hectic minds is a good thing, right? Mac Becks, a trans man and wrestler from Texas, was forced to compete against women because of the anti-trans legislation that Texas had in place that makes it so people have to compete on a team according to their gender marker of their birth certificate. Parents tried to ban him from competing. He fought against the ruling, not wanting to compete on the girls' team himself, yet because of all the work by TERFs and pushing the scare of trans women, he was stuck in the situation. He ended up winning the girls' state championships twice, creating conflict in his brain because of the hard work that he was putting in, yet having an advantage because of testosterone due to his transition. Trans men specifically get ignored during the moral panic that transphobic groups garner. It's often focused solely on trans women, to protect our women, to protect our girls. Yet, by not allowing trans athletes to compete against athletes of their own gender, it's really the women that lose anyway. It was never about fairness, and it won't be about that going forward. Some athletes have physiological advantages that push them to the top, things that can be viewed as unfair. But if it was actually about fairness, they should be looking at factors that actually play a role in sports. If you want fair, take a look at Michael Phelps and his lactic acid production, his height, his wingspan. Does that give him an unfair advantage against his competitors? Of course. But it's not about being fair. Transphobic legislation and the groups that lobby for it, they are more focused on sexism. While barring Mac from competing against other boys allowed him to have an advantage, there's also Andrea Yearwood. The gatekeeping and costs of medical transition meant that while she was able to race against other girls, she still had testosterone in her system, possibly giving her advantage as well. For Olympics, the ruling is very simple and straightforward. Yep, this is just high school competition. If competitive high schoolers are looking for scholarships, easy. College choices shouldn't be based on athletic capabilities. College and education should be a free right to anybody who desires it. While justified for the Olympics and international stage, if you want to apply medical transition restrictions on high school sports, then you're going to force a choice for athletes. A medical transition that they might not be comfortable with, or not competing with the gender they identify as. That also ties into medical gatekeeping that occurs with trans individuals, as many have hardships and failures to begin the medical side of transitioning due to finances, insurance, or simply the willingness of doctors. This, of course, completely ignores non-binary people as well who exist and could be pushed away from sports in general. Maybe let kids play sports with groups that they identify with, because playing sports can be an incredibly healthy outlet for them at that stage in life. And stop making everything in life about winning and losing. Maybe high school sports should be about inclusivity and well-being tied with personal or group goals. Ultimately, though, this boils down to conservative groups wanting to police girls and eliminate the existence of trans individuals. This takes away from the freedoms of women and girls. Grace Wagner is the daughter of Kristen Wagner, General Counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative nonprofit that pushes anti-trans bills around the country. She also testified on a federal complaint because her team lost in a state tournament game against a team that had an athlete who they assumed was transgender. Yet this transgender athlete in question was simply a cisgender girl that had short hair. All girls and all women are the victims in the anti-trans push, and the further that this is taken, we'll see the policing of women's bodies and a regression of women's rights. Everything has led to an international spotlight being put on in 2021 Tokyo Olympics and the qualifying of trans athletes for participation. One such athlete is Laurel Hubbard, the first transgender athlete to qualify for the Olympics. She's a weightlifter from New Zealand that began competing in women's international weightlifting in 2017. She's no stranger to weightlifting, though, and she has a body for it with natural capabilities. In 1998, she set records in the New Zealand junior competitions, but in 2001 stopped competing because of stress and pressures to fit in. After transitioning in 2012, she looked forward to competing again as her true self. In 2017, she competed in the heaviest category and won the gold. This sparked controversy as many felt it was unfair for the competition and that Hubbard shouldn't be allowed to compete against real women. Except this controversy really only gets pointed out when trans athletes win, doesn't it? Many trans athletes have been participating over the years, except they aren't very spectacular. Even Laurel Hubbard, who is set to compete in the Olympics, she's currently ranked 7th in the International Weightlifting Federation, which means that unless something drastic changes, she won't be winning any medals. When trans athletes don't win, they are brushed off. Most trans athletes aren't winning their competitions, and while transphobes don't like their participation at all, as long as they lose, it can slide. The only time fuss is raised is when they're actually the winners. And only then is it a huge issue, because it's an unfair biological advantage. The weightlifters that complained that allowing Laurel Hubbard was unfair and that it was ruining chances for cisgender women on their own stage, and that this is an attack on women's rights, and that men are taking over women's sports, and whatever other hate-based complaints are made, it's very overlooked by them that while Hubbard is a competitive force in women's weightlifting, she's not really close to being the top contender in the sport. She lifted a total weight of 273 kilograms in 2017 for her gold, which is 23 kilograms over the silver medalist, a large margin which is focused on by those who are vocally against her. Yet, that weight against the leaders of the sport is still over 30 kilograms shy of being the best. She's still 7th overall in the IWF, but that also means she's only 7th. In 2019, Hubbard had significantly increased her weight from 273 to 285 kilograms, yet at the World Weightlifting Championships, she only placed 6th. Li Wenwen lifted 332 kilograms, hailing from China. Tatiana Kasharina of Russia lifted 318 kilograms. Meng Sufing of China lifted 311 kilograms. Still ahead of her was a lifter from North Korea and the Ukraine. Also, while Hubbard placed 6th with 285, she actually tied in weight with Sarah Robles of the United States. This is the threat that trans athletes pose against cisgender competitors, not often above average and rarely the best. This is how trans athletes are taking over sports as we know it, through not winning or falling in line with average. And of all the transgender athletes, only 9 were set to even have chances to qualify for the 2021 Olympics, not 9 that did qualify. That's 9 athletes of the 11,000 athletes in total at the Olympics. That's an incredibly small figure for how large this manufactured moral panic is. Yet, the moment a trans athlete wins a gold in anything they do, it will spark huge amounts of controversy and anti-trans sentiments. Just don't expect that to happen anytime soon. There are certainly other trans athletes to note aside from Hubbard. Quinn will be on the Canadian soccer team. They are transgender and non-binary and play in women's soccer. They were on Canada's team in 2016 in Rio when the team took a bronze medal. They competed in the 2019 Women's World Cup. Following their 2020 coming out, the 2021 Olympics will be their first big stage for them since. Robin Lambert, a non-binary person who qualified for the Tokyo Paralympics, has already won medals on an international stage. She's a strong contender for the 100-meter T34 race and is bringing visibility and a positive community to Australia. Chelsea Wolfe, a trans woman BMX competitor, will be an alternate on the USA team to the 2 cis women. She locked in her position as an alternate for the team by coming in 5th place at the World Championship BMX competition in Montpellier, France. She will only be able to officially compete at the Olympics if one of the other team members, for any reason, can't. Still, being on the team is a wonderful step forward and shows that she can compete with the rest. Ness Murby is a genderqueer and trans-masculine competitor for discus and javelin thrower. They compete on the stage for Paralympics and qualified for the 2020 Olympics. Hopefully that means they'll make it to Tokyo this year. Valentina Petrullo, a trans woman from Italy, has qualifying times, but her acceptance is up to the Italian Paralympic Committee because she's trans. Even those that didn't qualify for the 2021 Olympics but came close are pushing trans and LGBT visibility in high levels of sport. Cece Telfer, a trans woman in track and field, and Nikki Hiltz, a trans non-binary person doing track and field, and Tiffany Ambro, a trans woman playing volleyball. Of the 9 who could have qualified, only 5 of them are trans women. Yet the whole discussion is, of course, completely ignoring trans men athletes and non-binary individuals. The fear-mongering around transgender competitors is always around trans women. With all the discussion about the Olympics, it is to note that the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, is looking to at least half their testosterone requirement for transgender females to be allowed to compete going forward from the 2021 Olympics. There are no IOC restrictions on trans men, of course. the narrative is spun that men suddenly decide that they want to become women, which just so happens to give life to their athletic careers. Clearly, they are just coming out as trans to be so successful or mediocre, or surely, if people are going through the massive hoops and subjecting themselves to all the hatred and negativity from society to transition, or be open about who they are, all to just dominate women's sports, then why aren't trans women dominating women's sports? Maybe, just maybe, the fact that they are athletes has absolutely nothing to do with them being trans, and that by being trans isn't a decision or a choice that they made one day. Yet, the ability to compete has been argued in the science community back and forth, and there doesn't seem to be many comprehensive studies or a good consensus. In 2004, a paper was published that detailed the muscle loss of trans women from administered hormone replacement therapy. This paper gave evidence that trans women would be at the levels of cis women in athletics after roughly 1 year of HRT, a standard that we see used today by the IOC. There have been multiple studies throughout the last 20 years, most of which support the basis of transitioning leads to trans women being significantly physically weaker than they were before transitioning, by the estimate of 10% at the upper strata of athletic capabilities. That's a huge difference. That's also the difference that a lot of men have over women in many sports, such as running. The fastest 100-meter by Usain Bolt is only 1 second, or about 10% faster than that of Florence Griffith Joyner. Any lingering differences in things such as bone mass density are brought to the forefront of the discussion to prove their biological advantage over real women. In May of 2020, a paper was published by Emma Hilton and Tommy Lundberg that goes against all evidence that says trans women have similar athletic capabilities of cis women, a paper that also happens to be not peer-reviewed. Emma Hilton is a British transphobe who has even given a speech for the Women's Place UK, a hate group and one of the more prolific and militant turf groups in the UK. Though she specifically put in her paper that there is no conflict of interest, so clearly there's no bias in her work. Clearly not the years of anti-trans activism she's been participating in. Nope. This paper is being used by TERFs all over to give evidence on why trans women aren't real women and why they shouldn't be allowed to compete, but this paper is very flawed in many ways. Hilton and Lundberg equate pre-transition women's physical parameters with those of cis men. However, there have been multiple studies on this that show the exact opposite. There are many reasons as to why, but lifestyle choices play a part in why even in pre-transition, trans women have less muscle mass and bone size and mass than cis men. In the paper, they compare cis men against cis women, and then in discussing muscle loss due to HRT, referred to the reference point of cis men to show a larger performance gap against women. They completely ignore the physical differences between trans women pre-transition and cis men. Hilton and Lundberg's study also conveniently does not height or weight match trans individuals against cis counterparts, while cis men and cis women have that matching done. This is specifically avoided to show an increased difference between trans women and cis women that isn't apparent if you height and weight match the subjects. Furthermore, they fail to show in a purposeful omission that trans women after HRT have comparable hemoglobin to cis women, and this is relevant to athletic capabilities and maximum oxygen consumption. They also ignore things like fat distribution and the role that estrogen has on trans women's bodies and their fat-free muscle mass. There's tons wrong with this paper, and if you want a detailed breakdown from someone who is actually qualified, check out Jangles Science Lab's excellent video that breaks down this study and refutes point by point what Hilton and Lundberg published. There's a link in the description. While very disingenuous and outright incorrect in a lot of their statements, Hilton and Lundberg's paper has been waved around by TERFs and their groups as factual evidence. It pushed the anti-trans narrative further and contributed to the growing fear-mongering of trans women in sports and in the world. One of the steps forward for these groups has been the policing of women's bodies and what a real woman actually is. This has had awful effects on women outright, but in an intersectionality between transphobia and racism has disproportionately affected African women in the Olympics. Firstly, was discussion about Caster Semenya, an alleged unfair advantage that she had. Caster is a middle distance runner, and she has 2 Olympic gold medals and has won 3 world championships. She competes in the 400 meter, the 800 meter, and the 1500 meter events. Following her wins in 2009, opponents began to question her sex, which led to her having to take a sex verification test, though the International Association of Athletics Federations, the IAAF, claimed they were investigating due to suspicion of drug use. Yikes. The IAAF then went on to create a policy on hyperandrogenism in 2011, a common endocrine disorder affecting 5 to 10% of all women. In 2016, Caster won the 400 meter, the 800 meter, and the 1500 meter titles in the South African National Championships. This caused fellow runner Lindsay Sharp of Scotland, who finished in 6th place, to break down in tears and claim that everyone can see it's 2 separate races. Joanna Jozwiak of Poland, who finished in 5th place, declared herself a silver medalist, curiously making note that she was the first European and the second white to finish the race. In 2018, the IAAF announced that they had new rulings on hyperandrogenism. To compete in the female classification, competitors needed to have below 5 nanomoles per liter of testosterone or take medication to lower it. This ruling applies only to those competing in the 400, 800, and 1500 meter categories. Caster has appealed the decision in the Court of Arbitration for Sport and the Federal Supreme Court of Switzerland, both of which were dismissed. She then filed an appeal in European Court of Human Rights, and a decision has not been ruled yet. Changing the rules to disqualify leading athletic women hasn't just affected Caster Semenya, and that was clearly an attack just on her. The policing of what defines a woman will continue to exclude women and erode their rights. The only way for Caster to continue competing in those categories she specialized in was to take hormone-suppressing medication that leaves her physically ill. How much further will these restrictions be taken? The upcoming Tokyo 2021 Olympics have barred 2 runners from Namibia from the 400-meter race, Christine Mboma and Beatrice Mazalingi, again citing testosterone limits, which means that they can still participate in the 200-meter race, which they also qualified, as testosterone limits don't apply to that race. These women were not aware that they had elevated testosterone. They were just women participating in women's sports. 2 more women were barred from the 800-meter race, silver and bronze medalists in the 2016 Olympics, Francine Niyonsaba of Burundi and Margaret Wambui of Kenya. Again, elevated testosterone. These are not trans women. They've not known about their elevated testosterone. Hyperandrogenism affects 5 to 10% of women. That's a huge amount of the population. The IAAF and the IOC have denied 5 women now from Africa. While the debates have had roots with trans women and fear-mongering of men taking over our women's sports, it's led to a policing of women's bodies that have hurt women overall and pushed back women's rights. In an intersectional turn, the debate has taken to targeting African women in an attack on their abilities to compete in the Olympics. This ruling, of course, is absolutely disgusting. Not eligible for female classification. Not eligible for female classification. These women are women down to the course, and the denial that they fit female classification is set by groups that are seeking to spread detrimental messages about what women are. And what is that? White fundamentalist Christian housewives with a petite frame and no desire for athletics? Who makes the guidelines? Who sets the rules? Why are women across the board the ones who have to suffer for this hatred? Trans women aren't taking over sports. Any data that suggests that they have some biological advantage over cis women fails to hold up in real-world circumstances. Trans women have repeatedly shown that they aren't dominating forces within sports and athletics, yet the spread of fear over girls and women due to imagined predatory trans women has had far-reaching consequences where the rights of all women suffer. Not only trans women, but cis women who don't fit specific arbitrary parameters of what people think a woman is. The policing of women's bodies is unlikely to stop there. Conservative groups continue pushing the boundaries as legislation is put through across America in transphobic haste. In all the efforts, trans men, non-binary, anything other than trans women in sports or spaces are conveniently ignored because they don't fit the narrative. Stop questioning women. Stop policing our bodies. Stop with the enough of something to fit the parameter. Thank you for watching this week's Congruent Coup. Stay cute out there, friends. Bye-bye.